Kansas Territory, 1884. Caleb Whitfield was 39 years old, and his right hand had started shaking too bad to hold a horseshoe steady. He noticed it first on a Tuesday, standing at his own forge, the hammer coming down a half-inch off where it ought to. He noticed it again on Thursday and Friday, and every day after that. An old war wound, the doctor in Abilene had told him years back. A ball that had gone clean through the meat of his forearm at Chickamauga and healed wrong. And now, 20 years on, the cold months made it worse than the warm ones, and he was 39 years old, and figuring out that a blacksmith with a shaking hand was a blacksmith without much of a trade left. He hadn't told anybody, wasn't anybody much to tell. Caleb had never married. There'd been a girl once, before the war, and then there'd been the war, and by the time he came home there wasn't much of the boy left who might have made a good husband to anybody. He'd built the forge instead. Built it up from nothing over 15 years into the best smithy in 3 counties, and it had been enough. A man could live a whole life on enough, he'd found, if he didn't look too closely at what else might have been. Lately he'd started looking. He stood in the forge that morning with his bad hand aching in the cold, looking at the row of tools he could still use, and the row he couldn't anymore. And he thought, not for the first time, that 39 was starting to feel like the far side of something, rather than the middle of it. He'd taken to doing the finer work in the mornings, before the ache set in bad, and saving the heavier hammering for whatever hours his hand would still cooperate. It was a slow way to run a business. Slower still when half his old customers had already drifted to the younger Smith 2 towns over, the one with 2 good hands and a reputation for speed Caleb couldn't match anymore. He didn't resent the man for it. Couldn't, really. A customer wanted his plow blade fixed by Tuesday. Not sympathy for an old soldier's wound. He was thinking on all that. The slow business, the empty house past the forge, the letters he never got from anybody, because there wasn't anybody left to write them. When the bell over his shop door rang, he didn't look up right away. Business had been thin enough lately that he'd half expected it was the wind. "I was told the blacksmith in this town was the best for 50 miles, a woman's voice said. "I'm hoping that's still true, and not just something people say to be kind." Caleb turned around, wiping his good hand on his apron, and found himself looking at a woman he did not recognize, and would not have believed, if she'd told him plainly right then, that he'd met her once before, 20 years past, on the worst night of both their young lives. Her name, she said, was Sarah Bishop, and she'd come about a hinge on a traveling trunk that had broken somewhere between Topeka and here. "I could fix it in 20 minutes, Caleb said, looking the trunk over. "Might take longer if my hand's uncooperative today." He didn't know why he said that last part. He never told customers about the hand. Sarah looked at him. A steady, assessing look, the kind a person gives when they're deciding whether to ask a question or let it lie. "Old injury?" she asked. "War," Caleb said. "Long time back. I'm a doctor," she said. "Was training as a nurse when the fighting still needed nurses, then kept on with it after. If you'd let me look at it sometime, I might have a thought or two. No charge. Call it professional curiosity." Caleb hadn't expected that, and it must have shown on his face because she smiled. A small, private sort of smile, like she was used to surprising people and didn't mind it. "You don't have to decide today," she said. "I'll be in town a while. My aunt left me some property here I've got to see settled." "Your aunt?" "Eleanor Marsh. Ran the boarding house on 3rd Street, years back before she passed." Caleb went still at that name, though he covered it well enough that Sarah didn't seem to notice Eleanor Marsh. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 20 years, and hearing it now sent something cold and strange down his spine, though he couldn't have said, standing there with a broken trunk hinge in his hands, exactly why. "Did you know her well?" Caleb asked, keeping his voice level. "She raised me," Sarah said. "My own people were lost in the war when I was very small. Eleanor took me in when nobody else would, and raised me like I was her own. God rest her. I owe that woman everything I've become." "Sounds like a fine woman," Caleb said, and meant it more than the words let on. "She was," Sarah said. "She used to tell me the strangest little story, growing up, about a coat and a cold night, and a stranger she never learned the name of. I always thought she'd embellished it some, the way people do with the stories they tell children. I'm only in town now to see what's left to settle of her affairs, and maybe get to the bottom of a few of her old stories while I'm at it." Caleb fixed the hinge. She thanked him and paid him $1 for it, over his objection, and left, And Caleb stood in his shop a long while afterward, turning the coincidence over, and telling himself it was nothing more than a coincidence, and not quite believing himself. The second time Sarah came to the forge, she brought liniment. For the hand, she said, setting the small tin on his workbench like it was nothing. It won't fix the nerve damage. Nothing will do that, but it'll ease the ache some, especially in this weather. I didn't ask for that, Caleb said. No, Sarah agreed. But you looked like a man who needed it, and I had a Tuesday free, and it seemed a fair trade for a fixed hinge. Caleb almost laughed at that, though he couldn't have said why the phrasing struck him the way it did, like an echo of something he couldn't place. You talk like a woman who's used to getting her own way, he said. I'm a woman doctor in a territory that still isn't sure it wants those, Sarah said. I learned early that if I waited for permission to do the sensible thing, I'd be waiting still. Use the liniment, Mr. Whitfield. It won't bite you. He used the liniment that night. It helped more than he expected. The third kindness was his. Sarah's aunt's old boarding house had sat empty 3 years, and the well behind it had gone foul the way abandoned wells do, and Sarah, set on fixing the place up to sell it proper, rather than let it go for a pittance, had been hauling water from the town pump twice a day for a week before Caleb heard of it from the mercantile clerk. He didn't ask permission. He showed up on a Wednesday with a coil of rope and a bucket, and spent the afternoon rigging her a pulley system that cut her hauling time in half. The same as he'd have done for any neighbor, he told himself, though he stayed longer than the job required and didn't examine too closely why. You didn't have to do this, Sarah said, wiping flour from her hands where she'd stepped out from baking. You looked like a woman who needed somebody not to ask permission, Caleb said. Seemed a fair trade. Sarah went very quiet at that, staring at him in a way that made him wonder if he'd said something wrong. You've got a funny way of phrasing things, Mr. Whitfield, she said finally. It puts me in mind of somebody I knew a long time ago. That's so, Caleb said, and let it lie, because he didn't yet trust the shape of the thing rising in his own chest enough to give it words. The fourth kindness took 3 weeks to arrive, and it near undid him when it did. Sarah had been going through her aunt's old boxes, sorting what to keep and what to sell, and she came to the forge one evening carrying something folded over her arm. A coat, man's coat, wool, blue-gray, worn thin at the elbows and patched twice at the collar, the kind of coat a person keeps for 20 years, only if it means something more than warmth. I found this in my aunt's cedar chest, Sarah said. She kept it my whole life and never told me where it came from. Said only that a stranger gave it to a half-frozen little girl on the worst night of the war, and that she'd meant to return it to him someday, if she ever learned his name. Caleb's hands had gone still on the anvil. He knew that coat. He'd made the second patch on that collar himself, sitting by a dying campfire in the winter of '64, 3 days before a burned-out wagon train limped into a Kansas town, with one small girl left alive in it, half frozen, wrapped in nothing but a horse blanket, and a young soldier, 19 years old, 3 months from his own discharge, half a stranger to kindness himself after what he'd seen, had taken the coat off his own back without a second thought and wrapped it around her, because it was the only thing he had left to give, and because some nights a person does the only decent thing available to them, and doesn't think past that. He'd never learned what became of her. He'd asked, once, at the aid station, and been told only that a woman named Eleanor Marsh had taken the girl in, and the army had moved him on within the week, and the war had a way of swallowing a person's unfinished business whole. I know that coat, Caleb said, his voice not quite steady. Sarah went very still. You're the one, she said. It wasn't a question. I gave a coat to a little girl outside a burned wagon train, Christmas week of '64, Caleb said. Never learned her name. Never learned if she lived. I was 7 years old, Sarah said, and her voice had gone thin. The way voices go when 20 years of not knowing collapses all at once into a single answer. I don't remember your face. I was too cold and too scared to remember anybody's face that night. But I remember the coat. I slept under it for a year after, before Aunt Eleanor made me a proper one. I kept it my whole life, because it was the only proof I had that somebody in that whole terrible war had looked at a half-frozen little girl and decided she was worth the coat off his back. Caleb had to sit down on the anvil stump. I never knew what happened to you, he said. 20 years and I never knew. Well, Sarah said, and there were tears standing plain in her eyes now, unhidden you know now. Now, before we go further, I want to pause and thank you for walking with me this far into the story. Some of you are listening from towns I'll never see, clear on the other side of the world, and I'm grateful every single time this old tale finds its way to somebody new. Back to Caleb and Sarah now. It was a boy from the mercantile, young Nathaniel, who ran errands for half the town and gossiped for the other half, who said the plain thing. 3 weeks after the coat was found, he was carrying nails out to Caleb's forge when he found Sarah there too. The two of them sharing coffee on the bench outside, easy and unhurried the way people get, once a 20-year mystery has settled into something warmer. Everybody in town saying you two are courting, Nathaniel announced, setting the nails down without preamble. My ma says it's the strangest, sweetest thing she ever heard of. A coat coming back around after 20 years like that. We're not courting, Caleb said too quickly. Then why do you look at her the way my pa looks at my ma? Nathaniel asked, entirely without malice. The way children ask the questions no adult has the nerve to ask plainly. Neither Caleb nor Sarah had an answer ready for that, and the silence that followed said more than either of them intended it to. Nathaniel, satisfied he'd delivered his message, went back to his errands, leaving the two of them alone with a truth they'd both been circling for weeks, and neither had named. Caleb named it 4 days later. He found Sarah at the old boarding house, sorting the last of her aunt's papers by lamplight, and he stood in the doorway a long moment before he worked up the nerve to speak. I'm 39 years old, he said. I've got a bad hand, and a business that's shrinking, and not much else to offer a woman who could have her pick of finer men in a bigger town than this one. That's not an answer to anything, Caleb, Sarah said. That's just a list of complaints. I'm working up to it, Caleb said. 20 years ago I gave you the only thing I had, because it was the decent thing to do, and I never once expected anything back for it. But you walked back into my life carrying that same coat, and every day since, I've found myself hoping you'd stay in this town a while longer than your aunt's estate requires. I'd like to court you properly, Sarah. Not because of the coat, and not because of what happened when you were 7, because of who you are now. A woman who brings liniment to a stranger's aching hand, and rigs no complaints about hauling her own water for a week. I like the woman sitting in front of me. I'd like the chance to know her better. Sarah set down the papers in her lap. You understand, she said, that I've got my own complications. I trained as a doctor in a world that doesn't always want women doctors. I've turned down 2 respectable proposals already because neither man could stomach a wife who kept working past her wedding day. I'm not an easy woman to court, Caleb Whitfield. Good, Caleb said. I was never much good at easy. Sarah looked at him a long moment, and then, for the first time since she'd walked back into his forge, she laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her. Well, she said, you might as well sit down, if you're going to be sweet at me this late in the evening. It was 3 weeks after that Dr. Aldous Greer came calling. Greer was the town's other physician, a widower of good standing, comfortable means, and a medical degree from a proper Eastern college. The kind of match, everyone in town agreed, that made a great deal more sense for a woman doctor than a blacksmith with a shaking hand. He was not an unkind man, or even a foolish one. He'd buried his own wife 3 years back to a fever no medicine could touch, and he made his case the way any sensible physician makes a case. With evidence, you've built something remarkable here, Sarah, Greer told her, standing in the boarding house parlor with his hat in his hands. But you've built it alone, fighting for every ounce of respect this county was reluctant to give you. I'm not asking you to give up doctoring. I'm asking you to stop fighting for it by yourself. Together, under one shingle, nobody in this county could deny either one of us the standing we've earned. It was, Sarah admitted to herself afterward, a genuinely fair offer. Fairer than most a woman in her position was likely to receive twice in one lifetime. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no right away either, and word of Dr. Greer's proposal traveled through town the way word travels in small counties, fast and mostly accurate, and straight to Caleb's ears within 2 days. Caleb sat with that news a long while at his forge, turning it over the way he'd turn over a piece of iron to check for a flaw. Greer could give Sarah standing, safety, a practice that no one would dare belittle. Caleb could give her a forge with a shrinking trade and a hand that shook worse every winter, and no guarantee that either one of those things would improve rather than worsen with time. He almost let her go without a fight. He sat with the arithmetic of it, those 2 evenings, the same cold way a banker might run figures on a ledger, except running them against his own worth instead of a stranger's. a fine practice and a proper degree, against a forge with a shrinking trade, a hand that had never shaken, against one that ached worse every winter and showed no sign of easing, a partnership built on standing and respect, against a courtship that had started, by his own admission, over an old debt neither of them had asked to owe. By any sensible measure, Grier was the surer bet. And Caleb had spent enough years running his own business to know exactly how a ledger like that would be scored. He got as far as writing her a letter releasing her from any claim on his feelings, telling her plainly that Grier's offer was the wiser road, and she oughtn't feel bound to a broken-down blacksmith out of gratitude for an old coat. Before he stopped, pen in hand, and read back over what he'd written, and found he didn't believe a word of it himself, it was Nathaniel, again, who tipped the scale, without meaning to. The boy came running to the forge breathless one evening. "Miss Sarah's not laughing anymore," he reported. "Not since Dr. Grier started calling regular. My ma noticed it too. Said something's gone quiet in her that wasn't quiet before." Caleb walked to the boarding house that same night. Sarah met him on the porch, and in the lamplight he could see she hadn't been sleeping easy. "Grier made you an offer," Caleb said. "It wasn't a question." "He did," Sarah said. "You haven't answered him." "No." "Why not?" Caleb asked. "He can give you standing I can't. Respect you'd never have to fight for. A partnership, not a courtship built on an old debt." Sarah was quiet a moment, looking out at the dark street. "Because he never once brought me liniment before I asked for it," she said. "Because he's never once looked at my hands, steady as they are, the way you look at your own shaking one, like it's just one more true thing about a person, not a flaw to manage. Because a boy doesn't run breathless to a blacksmith's forge to report that a doctor stopped laughing over a man who never made her laugh in the first place." She looked at him steady. "I don't want the safer road, Caleb. I've spent my whole life proving I don't need the safer road. I'll take true, even if it comes with a shaking hand and a shrinking trade." Caleb took the unfinished letter from his coat pocket, the one releasing her from any claim, and tore it once across the middle, right there on her porch. "I nearly talked myself into handing you to Grier for your own good," he said. "That was foolish of me. 20 years ago I gave you a coat because it was the only decent thing I had to give. I'm not near as poor a man now as I was that night, but I still don't have as much to offer as Grier does. What I have is this. I noticed you before I knew who you were. I liked the woman with the liniment and the water bucket before I ever learned she was the same girl I wrapped in wool on the worst night of my life. I don't want to hand any of that to another man, just because he's got a finer diploma than I do. I want to marry you, Sarah. Not because of the coat. Because you're worth the harder road, well," Sarah said, and her voice caught only a little. "It took you long enough to say the whole thing plain. Some things take a man 20 years to work out proper," Caleb said. "Seemed only fitting this one took a few more weeks on top of it." They were married the first Saturday of spring, in the boarding house parlor Sarah's aunt had once kept, with the windows open to let in the season, and Nathaniel standing up as the self-appointed witness who'd claimed, quite rightly, that he'd been the one to say the plain thing that got them there. No fine dress, no grand fiddle player. Just the county preacher, a borrowed ring, and the old blue-gray coat folded and displayed on a table by the door, because Sarah had insisted it deserved a place of honor at the one occasion it had, in its own quiet way, made possible. Caleb hung the coat, after that day, on a peg by his forge door, where he could see it every morning he came to work. "Why keep it there?" Sarah asked him once, watching him hang his own work coat beside it. "Reminds me," Caleb said, "that a person never knows, when they do the only decent thing available to them, how far down the road it might travel before it comes back around." 5 years later, Caleb Whitfield's hand had not gotten better, but his life had. He'd sold the heaviest forge work to a younger smith with steadier hands and kept the finer work for himself. The hinges, the small repairs, the work that needed patience more than strength. And between that and Sarah's growing medical practice, the two of them had built something neither had dared expect 20 years back on a battlefield, or 5 years back in a lonely forge. Sarah's practice had grown into the busiest in the county, women and children coming from 20 miles out just to be seen by a doctor who listened the way she did, and Dr. Grier, to his credit, had become in time a genuine friend to them both, having found, within a year of Sarah's answer, a fine woman of his own who suited him a good deal better than a marriage of convenience ever would have. On a warm evening that spring, Caleb sat on the porch of the house they'd built together, mending a bridle by lamplight, while inside Sarah hummed over supper the way she always did now. Easy, unthinking, a woman who no longer needed to prove anything to anybody. The house itself was modest, built on the lot behind the old boarding house, close enough that Sarah could still see Patience in the front parlor she'd converted for the purpose, and far enough that Caleb had a proper forge of his own out back, smaller than his old one, built to suit a hand that only worked half days now and didn't apologize for it. Nathaniel, 17 now, and apprenticed to Caleb at the forge 2 afternoons a week, sat on the step beside him, working at a scrap of leather of his own. "You ever think about it?" Nathaniel asked. "How one coat given away on the worst night of your life came back around and gave you all of this?" Caleb looked at the coat, still hanging on its peg through the open forge door, faded now near to gray. "Every single day," he said, "and I never once regret giving it. I'll tell you plain what this story taught me, because I believe it's worth carrying with you. It's this. Kindness given without expectation of return has a way of finding its way back to you, sometimes 20 years later, sometimes in a shape you'd never have guessed. You do the decent thing not because you'll be repaid for it, but because it's decent. And every so often, life is generous enough to let you see just how far that decency traveled. Give what you can, when you can, and trust the rest to find its own way home. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Caleb and Sarah. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I'm grateful you let this story into your evening. Until next time, keep listening.